One unified superpower. That was Joseph Stalin's promise. He envisioned a state of iron, but instead, he introduced a system of paralyzing fear. Why? Because for Stalin, loyalty was not enough. At first glance, a political process, but in reality, a death trap. The violence reached its peak during the public purges. The camera records the faces of the accused. Sweat runs down their foreheads. They recite scripts written by their interrogators. Stalin turned his closest allies into enemies. He signed the execution orders personally. Thousands of lives were destroyed. The scars on the nation were impossible to erase. 1934. By this year, Joseph Stalin held the Soviet Union in an iron grip. As General Secretary of the Communist Party, he stood at the very top of the hierarchy. Most rivals were already gone. Some were exiled. Others were forced into silence. The footage shows smoke rising from massive new factories and trains moving across the vast landscape. On the newsreels, the country looked unbreakable. Cities expanded. Construction cranes dominated the skylines. The government press claimed the socialist system was thriving. At first glance, a united nation, but in reality, a prison without walls. Behind the slogans and the smiling portraits, fear crept into apartments and canteens. People didn't speak freely, they whispered. They glanced over their shoulders before answering a simple question. Everyone understood the rules. One wrong word meant arrest. One joke meant the Gulag. A single denunciation could ruin a life forever. Inside the Kremlin, tension simmered. Not everyone trusted the leader. Why did the old Bolsheviks stay silent? They remembered Lenin's warning about Stalin's cruelty. But fear paralyzed them. Stalin systematically removed independent thinkers. He replaced them with yes men who nodded on command. Most were too terrified to object. But absolute power was not enough. By 1934, the dictator's paranoia reached new heights. He didn't just see rivals, he saw assassins. He believed spies and traitors were hiding in every ministry, waiting to destroy him. That same year, the 17th Party Congress opened in Moscow. It was called the Congress of Victors. The event was staged to celebrate the success of the 5-year plans. The hall was packed with top party officials, decorated war heroes, and hand-picked workers. In the frame, rows of uniformed men, medals shining under the electric lights. Speeches praised Stalin for hours. They called him the Great Builder. They called him the Father of Nations. But this was theater. Behind the rhythmic applause, many eyes turned to another man, Sergei Kirov. Kirov was the party boss from Leningrad. He was everything Stalin was not. He was warm. He was charismatic. He walked through crowds without heavy security. He shook hands. He laughed. Unlike Stalin, Kirov didn't rule through terror. Delegates looked at him and saw the leader the Soviet Union actually needed. Archive photos show Kirov smiling, surrounded by adoring workers. Then came the voting for the Central Committee. The delegates marked their secret ballots. They dropped them into the box. When the count finished, the numbers revealed a dangerous truth. Kirov received more votes than Stalin himself. It was a shock. The result was a quiet signal that the dictator's power had cracks. The applause for Kirov was a death warrant. December 1st, 1934. A single gunshot echoed through the halls of the Smolny Institute. Sergei Kirov, the charismatic leader of Leningrad, lay face down on the corridor floor. A bullet had entered the back of his neck. The assassin did not run. Leonid Nikolov stood over the body, a revolver still warm in his hand. Security guards tackled him within seconds. They pinned him to the linoleum, dragging him away before he could speak. The official report was released almost immediately. Nikolov acted alone. The motive was personal frustration. But the speed of the explanation raised suspicions instantly. Why did the guards fail to stop him? At the entrance, checks were mandatory, but Nikolov walked through with a loaded gun. It seemed like gross negligence, but the evidence pointed to a calculated setup. Nikolov was not a phantom. He was a known problem. He was nervous, unstable, and had been under police surveillance for weeks. He had even been detained previously near Kirov's route. Yet on this day, the security net vanished. He bypassed checkpoints that should have been impenetrable. He reached the third floor without a single challenge. Stalin did not wait for a telegram. Upon hearing the news, he boarded a train to Leningrad. He took personal control of the investigation. The footage shows. Stalin walks alongside the coffin, his face grim and unreadable. But behind closed doors, he was frantic. He interrogated Nikolov personally. Within hours, the narrative shifted. It was no longer a lone murder. It was a vast conspiracy. The secret police began their work. They arrested dozens of people linked to Kirov's staff. They pulled neighbors from their beds. At first glance, a swift response to a tragedy. But in reality, a methodical elimination of witnesses. Kirov's personal bodyguards were the first loose ends. They were arrested, driven away in black vans, and executed. No trial record survived. Historians later discovered the scale of the cover-up. Files were burned. Interrogation logs were rewritten. The physical evidence of the security failure was destroyed on Stalin's direct orders. But this was only the beginning. Kirov's death became the weapon Stalin had waited for. It was the perfect excuse. He declared that enemies of the people had infiltrated every level of society. The danger was not just in Leningrad. It was in the factories. It was in the army barracks. It was inside the Communist Party itself. Events accelerated. By 1935, Stalin had purged the lower ranks of critics. The prisons filled up, but he wanted more. He turned his sights on the top of the pyramid. He targeted the men who had once stood beside him, the old Bolsheviks. These were the veterans of 1917. They had stormed the Winter Palace. They had served under Vladimir Lenin. They commanded respect that Stalin could never buy. In Stalin's eyes, their history was a threat. They remembered the party before Stalin became absolute. They knew his flaws. Their independence made them dangerous. Why did he fear them? They offered an alternative. Their loyalty belonged to the ideals of the revolution, not to the dictator. Worst of all, many had a past connection to Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was the man Stalin hated most in the world. He was a hero of the Civil War, a brilliant orator, and Stalin's former rival. After losing the power struggle in the 1920s, Trotsky was forced into exile. He lived thousands of miles away, moving between safe houses. But distance offered no safety. Stalin turned Trotsky's name into a brand of treason. He claimed the exile was pulling the strings of a global plot. He alleged that Trotsky was sending secret orders to sabotage Soviet industry. The logic was brutal. If you had ever shaken Trotsky's hand, you were a suspect. If you had supported him 10 years ago, you were a traitor. The accusations required no physical evidence. The label Trotskyist was enough. Thus began the Great Terror, 1935. In the Soviet Union, hesitation was now synonymous with treason. Every glance was analyzed, every whisper was recorded. The most prominent targets were Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. These were not random victims. Both men had stood at Lenin's right hand. They had ruled the party alongside Stalin in the early 1920s. They knew the system because they helped build it. Why did they return to the fold? They believed cooperation would guarantee their safety. But reconciliation was a myth. In Stalin's mind, a past disagreement was not a mistake to be forgiven. It was a dormant threat waiting to be activated. The NKVD moved quickly. Agents swept through apartments, seizing archives and sealing doors. Zinoviev, Kamenev, and dozens of their associates were dragged into interrogation rooms. At first glance, a standard political purge. But in reality, the foundation for a massacre. The charges escalated with terrifying speed. Initially, the investigators accused them of spreading anti-Soviet ideas. That was not enough. Stalin needed a conspiracy. The narrative shifted. Suddenly, the files claimed they had joined a secret Trotskyist Zinovievist center. The paperwork described detailed plots with foreign spies to overthrow the government. Then came the event that shattered the nation's psyche. August 1936, the first Moscow show trial began. This was not a court of law. It was a high-production stage play. The goal was simple: convince the population that the leader was the only shield against chaos. The venue was the Hall of Columns, grand and imposing. The The footage captures the scene. The room is packed with stone-faced officials and foreign diplomats. Heavy black microphones stand on the tables, ready to broadcast every word to the farthest reaches of the USSR. On the streets, people gathered around loudspeakers. In factories and communal kitchens, citizens stopped working to listen to the transmission. In the frame, the defendants. Zinoviev and Kamenev looked nothing like the powerful leaders of the past. They appeared shrunken, exhausted, and broken by months of pressure. They stood before the judges and did the unthinkable. They agreed with the prosecutor. They confessed to impossible crimes. They admitted to planning assassinations. They confirmed sabotage orders. They claimed to have held secret meetings with Trotsky's agents in Europe. It was a parade of self-destruction. The accusations defied logic, yet the Soviet press printed the transcripts without a single edit. There was no questioning the script. Broken bones and sleepless nights. That was the hidden price of every public confession. What the public did not know was that the testimony had been extracted through medieval torture and threats against wives and children. Why did veteran revolutionaries lie about themselves? They hoped to save their families. But it was a trap. The verdict was immediate. On August 25, 1936, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and 14 others were declared guilty. The sentence was death. There were no appeals. Within hours, the executioners led them into the cellars. Shots rang out, but this was only the prelude. After that night, Stalin stopped looking for proof. He no longer needed logic to destroy his rivals. By 1937, the Great Purge transformed from a political cleanup into a national catastrophe. It spilled out of the Kremlin. It flooded every city, every factory, and every remote village across the Soviet Union. To direct this industrial-scale terror, Stalin selected a new instrument. His name was Nikolai Yezhov. The footage shows a man standing next to Stalin, barely reaching the dictator's shoulder. Yezhov was small, only about 5 feet tall, but his sadism made him the most feared figure in the empire. Behind his back, people whispered his nickname, the Bloody Dwarf. The name fit. The death toll under his command defied imagination. Stalin trusted Yezhov personally to sanitize the Soviet Union of what he termed internal filth. In early 1937, the machinery shifted gears. Stalin issued secret operational orders to the NKVD. The most infamous was Order Number 00447. It was a hunting license. The document gave clear instructions to liquidate anti-Soviet elements. The list of targets was endless: former nobles, priests, white army officers, and ordinary laborers accused of laziness. At first glance, a bureaucratic decree, but in reality, a quota system for murder. The order specified exact numbers: a specific number of people to arrest in each region, a specific number to shoot. It was mathematics applied to genocide. Local officials did not just obey, they competed. They requested permission to exceed their limits to prove their loyalty to Moscow. Events accelerated. That year, the NKVD arrested more than 1.5 million people. The prison system collapsed under the weight. Cells meant for 4 people held 40. The air was unbreathable. Interrogations ran on a conveyor belt day and night. Investigators beat suspects, starved them, and broke their wills until they signed pre-written statements. Families waited in lines outside prisons, holding parcels. They did not know their loved ones were already gone. Most never returned. Between 1937 and 1938, at least 700,000 people were executed. The process was mechanical. Each night, covered trucks known as Black Marias transported prisoners to isolated wastelands. The camera records, desolate fields lit by truck headlights. There, under the dim beams, the condemned were lined up. Engines revved to mask the sound of gunshots. Bodies were dumped into trenches. In places like Butovo near Moscow and Levashovo near Leningrad, the earth was later found packed with tens of thousands of corpses. The terror spared no one. It wasn't just about politicians anymore. The purge reached into the boiler rooms and schoolyards. Teachers, engineers, doctors, writers, and farmers faced accusations of espionage. There was no room for error. The church faced total annihilation. Priests were shot and believers were arrested as Stalin cleared the ground to replace religion with a cult of personality. Simple mistakes became capital crimes. If a machine broke on the assembly line, it was sabotage. If a worker complained about the lack of bread, it was anti-Soviet agitation. A single careless word meant a 10-year sentence. The Soviet people learned the art of invisibility. At work, they applauded Stalin until their hands hurt. In private, they stopped talking. Fear destroyed trust. Inside communal apartments, families spoke in whispers. They feared their neighbors. They feared their own children, who were taught at school to report suspicious behavior. The state encouraged betrayal. The government promised rewards for unmasking traitors. Public trials became theater. Newspapers published walls of text detailing fake conspiracies. Radio broadcasts glorified the NKVD officers as heroes saving the revolution. The population nodded and agreed. They pretended to believe the lies because the alternative was to join the dead. 1937. The terror entered its bloodiest phase. But Stalin was not satisfied. He turned his gaze to the one institution that could actually stop him: the Red Army. At first glance, the shield of the revolution, but in reality, a mortal threat. These officers were veterans of the Civil War. They had respect, they had tanks, and that made them dangerous. Why destroy your own defenders? Logic dictated they were essential against Hitler, but fear overrides logic. Stalin believed Nazi Germany had already bought his generals. He didn't wait for reports. He ordered the NKVD to forge them. The first victim was the Marshal, Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Young, brilliant, dangerous, he modernized the strategy. He prepared the country for war. The footage shows Tukhachevsky standing tall, medals gleaming, surrounded by admiring soldiers. This popularity was his crime. Events accelerated. In June 1937, the black cars arrived. Tukhachevsky vanished. The charge was absurd: German spy. The accusation: plotting a coup. 7 other top generals were dragged into the dark cells with him. The trial was a farce. No lawyers, no witnesses. The doors were locked. Inside, there was only pain. Interrogators beat the prisoners until they broke. The files show signatures written with trembling hands. Stalin received the verdict. He approved every death. On June 12th, the executioners finished the job. 8 bodies fell to the concrete floor. But this was only the start. The shockwave hit every garrison. The purge consumed the ranks. It wasn't just generals, it was colonels, majors, captains, 35,000 officers. That was the final count. They were fired, they were imprisoned, they were shot. The military academy stood empty. The result was catastrophic. In the frame, inexperienced lieutenants trying to read maps they didn't understand. Trust was dead. Commanders stopped making decisions. They froze. The Red Army was decapitated. 44,000 signatures. That was the personal death count authorized by one hand. By the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin did not just rule the Soviet Union. He owned the life of every citizen. His paranoia had evolved into a calculated system of elimination. He refused to delegate the final decision on mass murder. Every night, couriers delivered thick folders to his desk. These were the execution lists. Stalin sat for hours, scanning columns of names, biographies, and charges. He held a red pencil. A simple mark meant immediate death. Later analysis of the archives exposed the terrifying precision of his work. He personally approved over 44,000 individual executions. Why did he target his most loyal allies? Logic suggests they were his power base, but for Stalin, total loyalty was just a disguise for potential betrayal. Consider Alexander Poskrebyshev. He was Stalin's private secretary, his shadow, the man who guarded the door. He served the dictator with absolute devotion, yet the secret police targeted Poskrebyshev's wife. They accused her of anti-Soviet connections. Stalin did not intervene. He signed the paper. He watched the arrest. She was taken away and shot. Buskrebyshev did not protest. He swallowed his grief and continued to manage the dictator's schedule. The purge reached even closer. Stanislav Radins was Stalin's own brother-in-law and a former chief of the NKVD. Family ties offered no protection. Agents kicked down his door, dragged him to a cell, and executed him. At first glance, a political cleansing, but in reality, a signal that no one was safe. For those who escaped the bullet, a slower death waited. The trains took them to the Gulag. This was not just a prison system, it was an industrial empire of slavery. The camps formed a vast archipelago, stretching from the frozen taiga of Siberia to the scorching sands of Kazakhstan. By the end of the 1930s, 400 separate camps scarred the map. The scale of the transport was industrial. Between 1937 and 1939, the system swallowed 2 million new prisoners. Who were they? The intake forms show a chaotic mix. Most had committed no crime. There were no trials, no judges, no defense attorneys. A factory worker lost a wrench. A teacher arrived 5 minutes late to class. A farmer complained about the harvest. That was enough. Jealous neighbors wrote denunciations to settle personal scores. The secret police had quotas to fill, and they grabbed anyone to meet the numbers. Events accelerated. Life inside the wire was a battle for biology. Prisoners worked shifts of 12 to 16 hours. In winter, the temperature plunged below -40 degrees Celsius. Spittle froze before it hit the ground. Men and women hacked at the permafrost with primitive picks. They pushed heavy wheelbarrows with bare, frost-bitten hands. They built railways across swamps and dug mines in solid rock. The footage from the era shows emaciated figures wrapped in rags moving like ghosts through the snow. Shelter was nominal. At night, guards shoved hundreds of prisoners into unheated wooden barracks. They slept on bare planks, packed so tightly they could not turn over. Hygiene was non-existent. The air smelled of rotting wounds and unwashed bodies. Tuberculosis and scurvy swept through the bunks. But hunger was the primary weapon. Rations were minimal, often just watery soup and a chunk of bread. The guards operated with total impunity. A prisoner who slowed down on the march received a rifle butt to the spine. Anyone who collapsed was left in the snow to freeze. Some locations became synonymous with death. Kolyma, in the Far East, operated as an open-air graveyard. Inmates mined gold in conditions that killed strong men in months. There was no escape. Another hell existed in Vorkuta, deep within the Arctic Circle. Here, prisoners mined coal during the polar night. Darkness lasted for months. The wind cut through flesh. The statistics are dry, but the reality is horrific. In Kolyma, nearly 30% of the camp population died every single year. The corpses were piled into mass graves, preserved by the ice. This system had a specific purpose. The Gulag was not built to rehabilitate criminals. It was built to break the human being, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Terror became the oxygen of the state. Fear silenced every kitchen and every workplace. Stalin achieved total control. 1938. The Soviet purges reached their absolute zenith. The so-called Trial of the 21 was designed as the grand finale. It was a calculated public display of Joseph Stalin's total dominance. This time, the targets were not low-level functionaries. They were the last remaining giants of the Communist Party. Among the accused stood Nikolai Bukharin. He was once Lenin's close ally and the darling of the revolution. Beside him stood Alexei Rykov, a former Soviet premier, and, most shockingly, Genrikh Yagoda, the very man who had built the NKVD machinery. The man who had organized earlier show trials was now the defendant. The hunter had become the prey. The trial began in March 1938. The Hall of Columns transformed into a theater of the absurd. The footage preserves the scene. Bright industrial lights flood the courtroom. Dozens of cameras track every twitch on the defendants' faces. Prosecutors read endless lists of fabricated crimes, espionage, sabotage, plots to kill Lenin. The men stood under the glare, exhausted. Their suits hung loosely on their frames. Months of interrogation had done their work. Like the defendants before them, they did not argue. They confessed to every impossible charge. They recited their scripts word for word. Why did these titans crumble? It seemed impossible for such hardened revolutionaries to break, but the threat to their wives and children was more effective than physical torture. The audience in the courtroom watched in silence. Everyone knew the confessions were lies, but no one dared to even whisper. The message was clear. If Stalin could break Bukharin, he could break anyone. Nikolai Bukharin tried to maintain his dignity in the face of inevitable death. It did not save him. On March 15, 1938, the verdict was carried out. Bukharin was executed by firing squad. Rykov and Yagoda followed him into the dark, but this was only the public face of the terror. The cameras stopped rolling. The newspapers stopped printing headlines, but the killing did not stop. Behind the heavy doors of the Lubyanka and Butyrka prisons, the conveyor belt of death accelerated. The NKVD prisons were overflowing. There was no space in the cells. In forests and fields across the Soviet Union, trucks arrived at night. Soldiers dug trenches in the frozen earth. Thousands of bodies were thrown into these pits. No names were recorded, no markers were placed. The map of the USSR became a map of secret mass graves. By the end of 1938, Stalin had achieved his goal. The state was purged. He stood alone at the summit. There were no rivals left to challenge him, but the victory came at a catastrophic price. At first glance, the country was united, but in reality, the system was collapsing. The economy began to freefall. Factories missed their targets because the managers were dead. The army was headless because the generals were executed. Citizens lived in a state of paralyzed terror. Even foreign allies began to recoil from the reports coming out of Moscow. Stalin needed a solution. He needed to distance himself from the bloodbath he had ordered. He needed a scapegoat for the excesses. He turned his gaze toward his most loyal executioner, Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD. Yezhov was known as the Iron Commissar. He had carried out Stalin's darkest orders with fanatical precision. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. Stalin accused Yezhov of abusing power. He claimed Yezhov had distorted socialist justice and executed the innocent without permission. It was a lie. Yezhov had done exactly what he was told, but in Stalin's world, loyalty was not insurance. It was a liability. Events accelerated. In November 1938, Yezhov was quietly removed from his post. He was replaced by Lavrenti Beria, a masterful intriguer from Georgia. Beria was cold, calculating, and had been waiting for this opening for years. Beria immediately began a review of Yezhov's actions. He released a few prisoners to pretend he was restoring order. Meanwhile, he prepared the dungeon for his predecessor. By April 1939, Yezhov was arrested. The man who had tortured thousands was now stripped and dragged to the interrogation room. The cycle closed. For months, his former subordinates beat him. They forced him to confess to being a German spy, a terrorist, and a traitor. In February 1940, the end came. Yezhov was dragged into a prison basement. The floor was sloped to drain the blood. An executioner put a bullet in his head. But death was not enough. Stalin ordered his memory obliterated. Retouchers airbrushed Yezhov out of official photographs. Documents were shredded. He vanished from the history books as if he had never existed. The past was scrubbed clean. 1.2 million people. That is the minimum estimate of the dead. By late 1938, the Great Purge began to slow down. The sound of firing squads became less frequent. The black prisoner transport vans, known as Black Ravens, appeared less often on Moscow streets. But the damage was already absolute. Historians analyze the archives today. Some suggest the true number of victims is nearly double the official count. Why did the machinery stop? It wasn't mercy. It was because the target list was exhausted. The human cost defies calculation. It wasn't just death. It was erasure. Children returned from school to find empty apartments. Their parents had vanished into the Gulag system. These orphans were sent to state institutions. There, they were raised to denounce the very fathers and mothers who loved them. Whole villages stood silent. No men were left to work the fields. Some regions lacked doctors to treat the sick or teachers to instruct the young. The Soviet state appeared monolithic. At first glance, a global superpower. But in reality, a hollow shell. The Red Army had lost its most experienced commanders. Marshals, generals, and admirals were executed as foreign spies. The government ministries were staffed by terrified bureaucrats. No one dared to make an independent decision. To sign a document was to risk a death sentence. Industry suffered the same fate. Factories lost their chief engineers, universities lost their physics professors, research centers fell silent. But this was only the beginning of the stagnation. Creative voices were stifled or extinguished. A cultural grayness descended upon the nation. But for Joseph Stalin, this was not a tragedy. It was a triumph. In the dictator's eyes, the operation was a complete success. The party was cleansed. Potential rivals were buried in mass graves. Every surviving official knew the price of disobedience. They did not serve out of duty, they served out of primal fear. Stalin had achieved absolute, uncontested power. The Soviet Union was now a nation of whispers. Years passed in this frozen terror. Only the death of the tyrant in March 1953 broke the spell. Then came the shock. February 25, 1956. Nikita Khrushchev took the podium at the 20th Party Congress. The footage shows a hall filled with loyal communists. The camera records their faces turned to stone as Khrushchev speaks. He read the secret report regarding the cult of personality. He admitted that thousands were executed without cause. The delegates listened in stunned silence. For decades, they believed the arrests were necessary for the survival of the state. Now, the lie collapsed. The archives were cracked open. Some prisoners walked out of the camps old and broken. The government issued certificates of rehabilitation. They admitted the victims were innocent. But paper could not bring back the dead. Most names were never cleared. The bodies remained in unmarked pits. The scar on history would never fully heal.